Welcome to the first of what I hope to be many Petroyasic events, and it's a real pleasure to be introducing this book that we're about to hear a lot about. And reading the book, which I strongly encourage you to buy, it's really well written. For those of you who are here, there are copies for sale. It really brought me back the 1980s when I came of age, when there were sort of many numerous great heroes of democracy: Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, Lech Wałęsa in Poland, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. These were the people everyone knew about. None of them was Ukrainian. It could have been, I think, Vyacheslav Chernovil, who was a kind of Václav Havel type figure, but he did not win the 1991 election. But he did, however, share many ideological similarities with the current president of civic nationalism. But now, of course, Ukraine has produced its own, I don't know, Václav Havel, Lech Wałęsa, Nelson Mandela combined, plus a sort of, war hero. I think it's hard to come up with a direct historical equivalent, but one thing is true, that he is someone who is globally known and someone who really is, I think everyone agrees, a really remarkable and unique historical figure, both in terms of being on the right side of history, but also combining sort of moral correctness with the kind of wiliness of LBJ, right? It's an interesting combination. It's one thing to be right, but to actually be right and effective, that's pretty good. And so two wonderful scholars whom I known for years have written this book, The Zelensky Effect. And like all good books about historical figures, it's really not about him. It's really about a country and an historical epic. And that's what really makes this book a wonderful read, right? It's a sort of it's ostensibly about him, but it's really about something much bigger, which is the development of a civic Ukrainian national identity, and the emergence and strengthening of Ukrainian democracy. So first we have Olga Onuch, who, as she reminded me, was, I think, exactly 13 years ago tomorrow, was a Petroyasic postdoctoral fellow. She was among the more active ones. She was really she's, wherever she goes, it's she creates, it's a scene in a good way. And she presented her first book here, which is great, in this very room many years ago. And then she went on to become the first, the first Ukrainian professor professor of Ukrainian studies in the UK.
First professor of Ukrainian politics.
Of Ukrainian politics, right. So very different. So the first professor of Ukrainian politics at obviously a very crucial moment. And she's the winner of the 2017 Political Studies Association National Sir Bernard Crick Award for Outstanding Teaching as well. We also have from DC, my old friend, Henry Hale, who is a professor of political science and international affairs and co-director of the program for new approaches to research and security in Eurasia. He is someone who very much comes out of a study of post-Soviet Eurasia. I think his first wonderful book was on Russian parties that I quite enjoyed, and definitely worth going back to. It's a very cleverly written book and very sort of insightful. He's also written a wonderful book on sort of post-Soviet regimes, on patronal presidencies, and sort of the impact of sort of corruption on development of regimes. And so they have combined forces to produce this book, and I'm now going to hand it over to Olga to sort of begin a presentation on it, and then we'll move to Henry, and then I will field your questions, and I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucan. So I don't know if the person who's managing the Zoom can hear us, but it would be great to see Henry in big format.
Yeah, you're a little small, Henry.
He's a little small right now from our view, but hopefully by the time he joins in the presentation, we'll see him a little bit. It is, I just told Lucan that 13 years exactly tomorrow was my first day as a postdoc at the University of Toronto. And I knew nothing then, the most naive of academics possible. And if it wasn't for the Petro Jacek program, if it wasn't for Lucan's mentorship, along with Peter Solomon and Jeff Kopstein, who frequently came to my office and told me how young I was, but he said it in the nicest way possible. But real interest in my career when people didn't have to, and support. And I think coming back here this many years later, they always say it takes a community, it takes a village, and very much so the village here along these very halls is responsible for this. So if you don't like it, blame them. But let's start with the presentation. I'm first going to read out a little bit here. You see the image behind me, one that you probably are well familiar with. Fearless, earnest, Russian target number one, the man in the green t-shirt or green jumper, as may be the case here. As Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine unfolds in real time on screens worldwide, on your own screens, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky captured the global imagination like no one else. And I do assume that he captured yours as well. Just 3 years before that moment that you see before you, Zelensky was still just a television star, whose main qualifications, it seemed, for presidency was having played one on television. The Kremlin saw him a pushover, and I just got back from DC. I'm pretty certain that the folks in those offices also saw him as a pushover. Quite frankly, maybe here as well, and certainly in Paris and elsewhere. Rarely has a politician so visibly surprised so many, and I know for certain there are people in this room that were surprised by this man. The man Ukrainians call Ze, sometimes affectionately, sometimes not so affectionately, has come to symbolize this nation's fierce resistance to what many experts initially thought was a Russian military juggernaut. Yet, this full-on Ukrainian mobilization and Zelensky's potential to rally it should have been no surprise. The reason for its success is not that Zelensky had special leadership traits or that all of a sudden he became a certain president in wartime, but rather he had traits that made him extraordinary in war because it came from the very ordinariness of him as a Ukrainian. As such, he inherits, like all the other 44 million, so quote unquote, Zelenskys, a tradition of dissent and fierce civic sense that is baked into the country's identity and has been so for decades. He is this Ukrainian every person, albeit in a way that few others could be. And to understand how he came to be the man he is today, the first thing you must understand and know is Ukraine's long history of civic resistance, that Ukrainians have repeatedly taken to the streets en masse to struggle for their rights. And this is the thing. Our book is not so much about the man, but the civic nation that made him into the president he is today. That's the first side of the coin of the so-called Zelensky effect. The nation that makes him the president that then runs, first the candidate that runs for presidency in 2019, then the president over those years, and then, of course, the president in wartime. On the flip side of the coin is that very real direct effect Zelensky had on key constituencies in Ukraine. Those people that for nearly 30 years of democracy independence still did not rally to democracy. Those people that nearly 30 years of democracy and independence and Europe boundedness by all the politicians, quite frankly, even Yanukovych before he does his turnaround, did not support EU accession, did not support NATO membership. And in that period of his presidency, in those first 3 years, those who voted for him, those who voted for his party, moved to holding a strong sense of civic duty, to pro-democracy positions, to Euro-Atlanticist positions. And they, of course, were the front lines. So those are two sides of the coin. But it is this fierce sense of this fierce history of civic resistance and mass mobilization in Ukraine that really was the undercurrent for a lot of our thinking of explaining the story of contemporary politics in Ukraine and providing vignettes of Zelensky's life throughout. And this is why we start the book, in fact, in the 1990s. Well, actually, a little bit earlier. We start with the dissidents. Why? Because Zelensky talks to us about them. He does so in his television shows. He does so in his theatrical performance. He does so then during the political campaign for presidency on social media, in his speeches. And then he continues to do so as president over those first 3 years repeatedly. Henry and I are empiricists and we follow the data. And the reason we know this to be true, because we did a deep dive into what he says and how he says it and to which audiences, a discourse and content analysis of his speeches, of his appearances, of his social media posts. So that language that you then see after February 24th, 2022 is language that he has been repeatedly using over time. So we know what he knows because he's told us repeatedly. The fact that some of us weren't paying attention, including myself, initially, we can't undo time. But this is the case. We know from him that he understood that Ukrainians have a strong sense of civic identity, because he was very much one of those Russian-speaking Eastern Ukrainians that had a strong sense of civic identity himself and repeatedly talks about it. We know that he understood the import of dissidents over time, specifically those dissidents in central and southeastern Ukraine, because he repeatedly refers to them in key moments in time, such as on the eve of all-out invasion. He addresses the passing of Ivan Dzyuba. Ivan Dzyuba is one of the most famous Ukrainian dissidents. He was a Russian speaker until his 20s when he learned Ukrainian. He comes from Donetsk Oblast, in the east of Ukraine. And he was actually a supporter of the Communist Party, quite frankly. He wrote one of the most important treaties against Russian imperialism and chauvinism. But he was so convinced that the Communist Party would listen that he hand-delivered these treaties to them. Of course, the story does not end well. Who's Vasyl Holoborodko?
Well, he's the protagonist of For Room of People.
That is a Vasyl Holoborodko, but who is the Vasyl Holoborodko? I know there's people. A famous Ukrainian poet, in fact, a dissident as well. Vasyl Holoborodko, the fictional character that Volodymyr Zelensky played on TV in Sluga Narodu, is just that. That's his name. It's a story. It's fictional. But the real Vasyl Holoborodko is very angry that his name was used, denies having any connection to this. Zelensky's team and Kvartal deny having any connection to this and that they were thinking of this. I'm not sold on this, personally. Henry can say if he is or not. I don't think it's by accident. Vasyl Holoborodko, why he is so important, for those who don't know, is that being a poet, dissident himself, when he's at university, he's also from the east of Ukraine, when he's at university, he's printing out that famous treatise by Ivan Dzyuba and handing it out to his fellow students. Another individual that, just to give another example, that Zelensky uses to really get his message across is somebody whose poem we use throughout our book to divide all the chapters. Kostenko, Lina Kostenko, my favorite. Lina Kostenko, also a dissident poetess. It was her birthday on March 19th. On March 20th, President Volodymyr Zelensky is talking about the potential treason that opposition party members and certain political elite might be engaged in, or collaboration acts or might be considering. He addresses them in this speech on March 20th. But he does say so with the following words. Should have had this marked. Ukrainian poet Lina Kostenko celebrates her birthday on March 19th. I sincerely congratulate you. On behalf of all Ukrainians, I remind you, and now he's again speaking of those opposition politicians, of her words today. There is no need to think meagerly. And so the poem continues. The last line of that poem is, when a person has a nation, she is already a person. That your personhood, your individual contribution to this is about the nation that you belong to. And it is this sort of reflection, this sort of discursive embodiment of the civic nation message, duty to get engaged, to pay taxes, that a good Ukrainian votes and pays taxes above anything else. And then a repeated message that that which divides us, such as our language practice, is nowhere near as strong or important as that which unites us. That history of civic resistance, that history of multiple ordinary Ukrainians rising up to their civic duty. And this is the story we tell of Ukraine. And this is why we wrote the Zelensky Effect. Those two sides of the same coin that we think were missed by so many. And now Henry's going to take over with some more bits and pieces.
That was brilliant.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Yeah, first of all, again, just thanks for including me virtually. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. Would love to see everybody there face to face, but this is thanks to technology. I'm very happy to be able to join in, and so thanks to Lucan and the center for putting on this event. As Olga has discussed, the book is generally addressing this large question of why it was that Ukraine successfully mobilized and resisted what seemed to be a Russian military juggernaut in February of 2022, and what Zelensky's role was. And so Olga, I think, has very nicely highlighted the core features of the book that help explain that and talk about the bigger contribution that the book makes. And so what I wanted to do today was just to talk a little more concretely about the structure of the book and some of the related contributions that we try to make in the book in terms of related arguments. So as Lucan mentioned in the introductory remarks, the book is not written to be like a biography in the way we normally think of biographies. It's not just a simple narrative of Zelensky's life, and it doesn't tell the story and doesn't try to explain what's going on now in Ukraine as a product of Zelensky, right? It's not a message about a hero leader rescuing Ukraine, without whom the country would have been doomed. I mean, not at all. Instead, as Olga's remarks made clear, what it really is a story of Ukraine. And so we tell the story of Zelensky as part of and through the history of Ukraine. And so there are three levels through which we tell this history of Ukraine effectively. So at the broadest level, we're talking about the people themselves, in particular their senses of national identity, senses of civic duty. And we tell this story through nationwide opinion polls going way back, but emphasizing polls that we ourselves have been involved in. And much of this work we've done together starting in 2014. And so we tell the story of Ukraine, first of all, through the story of the people themselves and their views and attitudes. And then on a slightly smaller scale, we focus on the particular experiences of the independence generation, people who are generally tend to be in their 40s now, people of Zelensky's generation, people who might have at the tail end, kind of the one end of this generation might remember Chernobyl. They would certainly remember Ukraine's acquisition of independence. They grew up, rose to adulthood during Ukraine's early years as an independent country, but were not yet old enough to really focus or to be able to contribute to the country's fate. And they rose to prominence much later. And part of the story of the book is how they rose to prominence, different groups within this independence generation at different times, and how they rallied to the cause, as Olga mentioned, up to the present day when they occupy leadership positions in the country. And so then within the independence generation, then we also tell the story of Zelensky and try to talk about him and his life and what he means and what he reflects, and the skills that he's developed, the networks of colleagues that he works with politically, and his influence, as part in the context of this larger development of Ukrainian history. And of course, this is all contextualized with what we hope is effectively a political history of Ukraine that could be used in courses as basically a kind of textbook, following the different political periods of independent Ukraine, but of course with a focus on the more recent periods. So the first chapter is largely an overview, making a larger point and making some of the arguments as to why we previously, we as a scholarly community and the intellectual class and policy analysts, so many people were mistaken about their interpretations. Then chapter 2 really focuses on the independence generation itself and traces their rise and Ukrainian history from the late Soviet period through the Orange Revolution. And chapter 3 then we call Orange is the New Corruption. And basically here we talk about the disappointment that was generated after the Orange Revolution, when so many people mobilized and had such high hopes for the country, that things were going to change, that it was finally going to overcome many of the problematic legacies of the past. You had new leadership, an attempt to steal an election thwarted by people power, but then it turned out for a variety of reasons that people kind of got the same old politics again, although in a different, more competitive form. But that competition, often just from the people's point of view, looked like political infighting, an inability to get things done, struggle for power that really wasn't taking into account the needs of the people. And so, of course, it was against this backdrop that we had the rise of Viktor Yanukovych, who was the person, of course, ousted in the Orange Revolution, whose attempt to steal the presidential election was thwarted. He was now voted back into office in pretty much a free and fair presidential election in 2010. And we talk about, the story that probably in this room people are quite aware of, about him pulling Ukraine away from Europe, particularly, under pressure from the Kremlin in 2013. And so, here, so that leads us into chapter 4, which we call The Art of Politics, which begins with the Euromaidan mass mobilization and the Revolution of Dignity, and covers Zelensky's rise to political prominence, among other things. So the previous chapters all take a look at Zelensky. Chapter 2, the independence generation, looks at some of his early childhood, what we could learn about it, and some of his formative experiences, his relationship to his parents. And in the chapter 3 on the Orange is the New Corruption, we talk about his role. And one of the points we make is that he was not particularly politically engaged at this particular time, in the sense of not having a prominent place in the orange politics, and his parents being on the side of the blues. But chapter 4, once we get the Euromaidan mass mobilization and the revolution, he really starts to become much more politically active. And so this is the chapter where we talk about this. And I'll come to some of the particular points a little later that we make here, but I just want to talk about the structure of the book briefly just to start out. Chapter 5, we focus on Zelensky's presidential campaign. The argument that we make there, among other things, is that in fact, this campaign was pretty widely misunderstood. It was dismissed almost, out of hand as something kind of fluffy and not serious, whereas in fact, there was a very serious message that was being communicated. And in fact, the message was very much the same, including the means through which the message was disseminated were also very much the same as we see today in his leadership against the Russian full-scale invasion. So chapter 6 focuses on Zelensky's presidency himself and what he was able to accomplish and what he failed to do, the problems and missteps that he made, as well as some of the successes. So we try very much there to take a balanced perspective. So of course, he has many critics, many more critics he had right up until February of 2022. And so, one could dwell for a very long time on, every single misstep or personnel misjudgment. So we talk about those, but we don't dwell on them, and we try to take a look at the big picture. And we think if you step back and take a look at the big picture of his presidency, in Ukrainian context, it was actually fairly effective in the sense that, for example, if you take political popularity, his standing in the polls, right? It's well known that he started out with this landslide election victory. Then his ratings declined, more or less steadily up until February 2022, although there were ups and downs, and wasn't completely a straight line. But if you actually, so on one hand, there seems to be this disappointment that's emerging. So true. But what we try to do is present the perspective of, well, this is something that has happened to almost every single president in Ukraine. And if you actually compare his public standing 3 years out from what the public standing was of his predecessors, he comes out looking quite good. And this was despite the fact that he had to deal with the unprecedented challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic posed, both to the economy and just to state policy more generally. He was able to accomplish a lot of reforms that he had promised. Again, not all. So, again, there are pluses and minuses. And one of the things we also talk about here was his attitudes towards Russia, which in his campaign, he was a candidate for peace, for sitting down and talking with Putin and trying to just stop the killing, right? He kind of was saying that, well, Putin's basically he's a human being. We can sit down and talk with him. We shouldn't be, only thinking about conflict. But as we make clear in the chapter on his presidency, he quickly himself realized that this had been naive. By the end of the first year, you see a clear change in attitude there. Including not just reversing some of the tentative concessions he had made, hoping to lure Russia to the negotiating table, but continuing and even strengthening a lot of the Poroshenko era cultural and language policies, requiring the Ukrainian language in a lot of settings, banning cultural products coming from Russia. As we note in the book, even one of his own films was banned under his own administration for featuring a co-star who had from Russia who had visited Crimea without authorization from the Ukrainian state. So, again, it's an interesting mixed bag, but we do find evolution there. And we also find signs of kind of learning on the job. But on the whole, he turns out to be a fairly effective president in Ukraine's context. In chapter 7, we talk about Zelensky and Ukraine at war. And there, I think Olga has very nicely summed up a lot of the main argument, including that what we're seeing in his leadership in war is almost entirely the same Zelensky that we saw beforehand, the same messaging, the same style, the same means of communicating with the public. The one difference is probably, the big difference would be the attitude towards Russia. But we also argue that had already changed already, by early 2020. And then chapter 8, we title Ukraine's Future History. And here we discuss the interest that he's displayed in history throughout a lot of his entertainment career, but also especially in his campaign campaign and as president. But we point to, among other things, The Servant of the People television show, where, of course, the main character is a historian. It's replete with references to history and emphasizing the importance of knowing history to avoid repeating problems from the past. And so here we talk about a lot of the challenges facing Ukraine, including potential threats to democracy that could come from Zelensky himself, including his own presidency. Should the popularity go to his head? Should he come to equate himself too much with the Ukrainian state and cause, perhaps fueled by the observation that many make that there really aren't politicians anywhere close to of his stature now who would easily present an alternative. Politically centralizing tendencies related to the war effort that kind of run up against the local initiative that has been so important in fending off Russia during this war, right? So when Zelensky's removing mayors or basically concentrating the ability to prosecute oligarchs, attacking them, all these things on one hand can be interpreted as good for promoting the Ukrainian military cause, organizing the resistance, reducing corruption. On the other hand, if it winds up concentrating all power in his hands, then this could be a threat to democracy. So, what we want to do is lay out there, some of the real challenges that Ukraine faces in hopes that, this will be something that ultimately will serve Ukraine well in the future, because the victory in war could bring Ukraine a lot of opportunities to really consolidate its democracy and push it more to a stronger, healthier democracy than it's had in the past. But a lot depends on Zelensky ultimately doing the right thing. One thing that gives us hope there is that Ukrainian society is so strong, and there's a lot of kind of what we would describe as sort of maybe even grudging acceptance and grudging support for Zelensky in the war effort, right? Because people wholeheartedly support his leadership of Ukraine in resisting and defeating Russia. But underneath, they're not very happy with a lot of things that he's done. They're worried about threats to democracy. They might prefer other policies and realms related to culture, identity, language. That group is substantial. We find it's not a majority, but it's big enough that and the willingness of the population more generally to protest when they see injustice at the level of the government, which the survey evidence shows has remained strong, despite even in the context of the war. All these things will make it very hard for Zelensky or people around him to try and basically undermine democracy, whether it's ill-willed or well-intentioned in the future, combined with the pressures and the incentives that the European Union will provide. So there's room for optimism there. Maybe just briefly, let me highlight a few of the additional findings that we put forth. I'll just kind of advance some of those for discussion. One is there's an argument that we present on why Russia launched its full-scale invasion at the timing that and the timing when it did in February 2022. And this is basically the idea that initially Zelensky was misunderstood not only by a lot of people in the West, and including some people in Ukraine, but also by the Kremlin for different reasons. But basically, they thought in the Kremlin that when Zelensky was elected in 2019, they were getting what they had worked for and what they had long wanted, because you had suddenly a president elected in Ukraine who, first of all, was viewed as simply a comedian, kind of a joke, so he could easily be manipulated from the Kremlin's perspective. They thought this was hilarious. At the same time, he was also someone who came from Ukraine's southeast, was primarily a Russian speaker, which in Kremlin Russian ideology translates into, well, they must be secretly at least loyal to Russia or will be responsive to our efforts to woo them. He was of Jewish heritage, so that should further alienate him from the Ukrainian national cause. And he had been calling for peace, as we mentioned before, and calling for sitting down and talking with Putin and ending the war. So from the Kremlin's perspective, they thought, okay, finally, all our attempts to manipulate the political process are paying off. He won in this landslide. Sort of the nationalist side of the Ukrainian spectrum, represented by Petro Poroshenko, was defeated resoundingly. So great. But what we talk about in the book, in part, is how the Kremlin quickly became, they came to realize as well that they had badly misunderstood Zelensky and Ukraine itself, including what he represented and reflected in Ukraine, particularly about its quote unquote Russian speaking population and people in the Southeast. And so, around that time, Kremlin pretty clearly realized that in order to advance their agenda of bringing Ukraine into the back into the Russian sway, into the imperial fold, if you will, it was going to require the use of force. But then COVID intervened, so there was this time which there was clearly kind of a buildup and waiting until Russia could remobilize, and then we get the events of February 22nd. And there are a lot of reasons why people in the West, many got their predictions wrong. Maybe I won't go into those right now, just because we could bring it up again if people are interested in the reasons. But I guess maybe I'll just wrap it up there for now, because I've already talked for a while, and we want to make sure there's plenty of time for discussion, and we can just address the themes that interest you most. But thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by asking a question or two, but in the meantime, I hope all of you, and including those online, will post. I see it's totally empty. There are no open questions. Come on, guys. But I'm sure you have tons of questions here. But I'm going to start with what I see as sort of the main kind of thesis of the book, which I think is completely true, which is about Ukraine's civic identity. And so if I could have either one or both of you, first of all, just talk a little bit more about what you mean by civic identity, and then where it comes from historically in Ukraine. I mean, I remember in the early 1990s when everyone was talking about the rise of nationalism. This is before populism became a thing. I remember even at the time being struck that while there seemed to be a far right, a serious far right in Poland and in Hungary and other places, there was a far right in Ukraine. You just had to get a magnifying glass to find it, and so why it was so small then. So if you could just talk about a little bit about that.
Henry, shall I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
When we're in person, there's a lot of, shall I go? Shall you go? So this time I'll have to look directly at you there. So first off, I'm not going to comment on the size of the radical right and the magnifying glass needed to find them, but I am going to comment on what we mean, or certainly what I mean by civic identity. And it is this, there's obviously different types of nationalism and national belonging, sense of belonging. And one of those is one that is civic, that is focused on the state, that is focused on the civic actions that a citizen should engage in to be a member of that collective. Yeah. So this is a fierce attachment to the state and one's responsibilities as a citizen within that state, as opposed to as driving the main connectivity of belonging, as opposed to simply ethno-national, right? That you have to be of Ukrainian descent or you have to be a Ukrainian speaker in order to belong to this collective. There are, of course, it's not a clear cut. We do talk about in the book that these things can overlap, sometimes nicely, sometimes not so nicely, that for some people they do in fact overlap, and for some people they don't. And that there is debate within Ukrainian political elite about which type of nationalism should be the primary one. Specifically, some believing that it should be ethno-national in nature, that prioritizes descent and language practice, and one that says that it's the actions and civic attachment to the state, the protection of the state above everything, that is more important, or perhaps just acknowledging it, that it is the dominant sense of collective attachment and belonging. So in our research over the last 9 years, a little bit more actually, almost almost 10, Henry, we have been specifically trying to understand these different types of identity, civic, ethno-linguistic, ethnic of various flavors, and how they vary, and when and how are they important, and more even perhaps importantly for those of us who are the nerds who like the numbers, how they should be measured, right? And how we should track them. Because quite frankly, asking someone simply what language is their native language may or may not mean anything about their language practice, and may or may not be connected to the survey that they would rather conduct, the language of the survey that they would rather conduct the questionnaire in. So these sorts of things we've been exploring for some time. Henry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add there, other than, I think just, it was very interesting to us to look at how Zelensky, tapped into this over time, including in a lot of his performances. So if you go and look on YouTube and search some of his concerts, a lot of the songs that he would sing, are appealing directly to this, and this notion that kind of what bonds us together as Ukrainians. It's not only attachment to the state or citizenship per se, but it's a broader sense of common experiences as Ukrainians, right? Which is, of course, defined largely by your relationship to the Ukrainian state, particularly as it exists since statehood, but more generally as Ukrainians of all languages and all stripes. So there's like one particular song that he performed at the end of one of his concerts that I think struck both Olga and I, where they're singing, and it's called "The Country of Strong People." And basically, while they're singing this song, there's a running video it's more images in the background flashing, and they're images from all different parts of Ukrainian history, but in particular ones that people would remember just following common events. So it refers to the shared hope that people experienced with the Orange Revolution, but then the shared disillusionment. So even in that context, it's framing disillusionment not as disillusionment with the nation or the country, but just as a common experience that binds all Ukrainians together. Along with all the other experiences, the highs and the lows, the touchstones of kind of popular culture. And so, this was a kind of message. I mean, that particular song or video, we found particularly telling, but it's telling of a broader theme that, appears much more broadly. And so, that's the kind of thing that we try to tap into using the survey data as to kind of what this civic notion of identity means. Of course, you can never completely, separate civic, ethnic. There's always like some content that's blurred in. Not all the people that we would consider maybe cultural, kind of ethno-nationalists really see it that way. There arguably is some cultural content to a civic nation. There's contestation over what it should be, exactly where the boundaries should be. And there are always people on both sides of the boundaries that push at it. But, we're making this broad distinction, which we do think is telling and meaningful, and was an important part of Zelensky's message, which resonated, both for him in popular culture, then his rise to the presidency, and ultimately his leadership of the country in this time of war.
Thanks. It's interesting you say that, because I remember when Zelensky was often called a populist, which seems to be, populism can mean anything, so I'm sure you can come up with a definition of populism that he fits. But in terms of the dominant sort of de facto definition of one who sort of, in the contemporary wars, era, stokes divisions, he was in fact the kind of anti-populist, even though he was an outsider. Interesting. So I want to ask another question, which is about the sort of first days of the war. And I think there's, I've studied this a lot, but I've been, don't quite understand sort of, the source of Ukraine's success. So how much do you think, the first weeks when everybody thought, that it would be or some people thought it would be a 3-day war, and Russia obviously was bogged down. You saw these huge lines going to Kyiv, and sort of, broadly speaking, beyond sort of, Zelensky's obviously presence on social media and his famous picture in front of the presidential palace, how much of a role did his leadership play in that period, other than as an image? In other words, was he sort of, did he mobilize, or was the response primarily kind of spontaneous, kind of civil society rising up, combined obviously with incredible Russian ineptitude? So what was the role of his leadership in the first kind of weeks?
Henry, do you want to start?
Yeah, no, you go ahead. You go ahead.
We have a very nice
I
clock.
can if you want. I can if you want. So.
How about you start this time and I'll follow you? Yeah.
Just jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what the story we tell is one where, bottom line is the source of the success is primarily the Ukrainian people, right? So what we're not saying is that you wouldn't have seen, this kind of mobilization without Zelensky. That said, you could certainly envision leaders that might have messed things up in some way. But wouldn't have, I think, changed what ordinary people on the ground did so much, because that was just really spontaneous. But you can imagine people complicating the war effort a lot more than what he did. I think kind of one thing was as part of the military response, as military leader, he adopted a very different approach from that of, say, Putin, who micromanaged his war effort. So Zelensky's approach was, very much to let the generals make the call on the ground. And in part, this reflects military assistance and advice, that had been part of reforming Ukraine's military after 2014, which decentralized command structures. So Zelensky was not trying to kind of get involved and call the shots, and there was respect for generals and trying to keep them in. So there's that. I do think that the symbolic element that you point to was very important, because it's important to have a symbol, someone to just kind of communicate both internally that, there is a center of here, and that we have not given up, right? We are still here, because a lot of the predictions were that, he would leave, right? I mean, that's why his famous statement that he may or may not have actually said about, I need, ammunition, not a ride, not evacuation, was important, is because it demonstrated to people the resolve of not only the people, but the government to stay fit, and helped ensure the continued functioning of Ukrainian state structures through that time, including through initiatives, electronic government type structures that had been developed in the years prior. But I think that itself was very, very important. And then there's the international messaging component, where his communication skills became very, very important as well. And I think kind of important for a couple of ways. One is simply the communications abilities, right? He has this great knack for recording all kinds of short videos, short messages that, are to the point, they resonate well. It's him combined with a very effective team that does that. But there is also the just simply ascriptive quality of who he is that was important, especially in the international messaging, which was just basically giving the lie to the Russian narrative just by being who he was and doing what he did, which was, here he was, somebody of Jewish heritage from Eastern Ukraine, primarily a Russian speaker, someone who had advocated peace, risking his life and rallying full-throatedly, with all resources at his disposal against Russia. And so, for, just that in and of itself kind of helped undercut claims that, Putin was trying to get out there, which was that, well, this intervention was done on behalf of Russian speakers who have been victimized by, genocidal, Nazi leaders in Kyiv, which is, of course, absolutely ridiculous, but, to uninformed people could be influential. But the fact that you had somebody like Zelensky leading the country just made it patently obvious on its face that this it couldn't even be considered. I think there was that element as well that was important, particularly for, the international community, which has been important in arming and rallying, support, logistically in terms of resources and materiel for the struggle. That would be kind of my initial set of thoughts on that.
And if I could just add to that very quickly. So two things I'd like to add. One is I am so thankful that Zelensky spoke about protests all the time and dissidence, the stuff that I researched and spent the last 18 years of my life studying, because he gave me the opportunity to then talk about them in this book. And I think it's that the fact that Ukrainians have been engaged for multiple instances over time in direct civic action, and that it was not simply a Western Ukrainian speaking endeavor. And that is an incredibly, well, that's empirically false analyses of many of these moments of mass mobilization, not least that which happens after 2013-14, when we know, and there's work by Emma Mateo and others who we cite in this book, that there were across all regions of Ukraine large protests. They're less understood, they're less well known, they're less well documented, because first of all, you find what you go looking for. So that element of Ukrainian civic engagement that was growing and growing over 30 years across all parts of the country, and I can give you more and more data because I'm the person who studies these folks, that was an element that I think those of us who were in some of those rooms talking to folks who were going through the briefings, we just spoke about this in Washington actually, we hoped to God, especially those of us who have friends and family who we love in Ukraine, we hope to God that they were wrong, but then you reminded yourself, I actually have been studying this population for X amount of years. I know the types of engagement that they have been doing over these years, and I know what's driving that engagement, and it is not simply because their grandmother was Ukrainian and that they are a Ukrainian speaker. And when you understand that, you start understanding the bigger story. And I think Zelensky understood that, although being a late riser, and we talk about that in the book, he did join in this effort, and there's stories about his engagement. But he tells us these things. He tells us he knows this about the Ukrainian population. So we have snippets throughout the book of his speeches and of his theatrical performances. And on February 14th, 2022, therefore, before the moments of the all-out invasion, and I now want to address all those who stayed with Ukraine and in Ukraine, but those who left at the most crucial moment. Your strength is not in your money and planes, but in the civic position you can show. Return to your people, to the country due to which you got your factories and wealth. Today, everyone passes a real test for a citizen of Ukraine. Pass it with dignity. Let everyone understand for whom Ukraine is really the homeland and for whom it is just a platform for making money. Stressing the civic elements, that what you do now as a citizen will be the most important thing, right? That what you do in these moments will be the true citizen test. And then, of course, on March 4th, already following all-out invasion, us now knowing that Ukraine is not going simply to come to its knees in 3 days to 2 weeks or whatever. He says, great people of a great country. Ukrainians are united from Uzhhorod to Kharkiv, and so on and so forth. Ukrainians have shown themselves, they did not allow themselves to be deceived in a cheap, cynical show, which Henry just talked about. Our people remain Ukrainians. How our people stay with our state, even temporarily finding themselves in darkness. And again, he repeats these messages. It cannot, although that's not what drove the ordinary citizens with their bare hands to stop tanks, his constant reminding them that this is what they should be doing, regardless of whether or not you are ethnically Russian, a Russian speaker in Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine, that there's only one way to be a good citizen at this time, has to be incredibly powerful. And so I think that cannot be understated, that if your leader is championing these civic messages and highlighting over time and again, that does play an important role.
Right. So this next question from one of our audience, so I encourage more of you to jump in. From Sophia Isaiah is very apropos. She asks actually two interesting questions. I'm going to focus on the first one first, which is about Zelensky's direct relationship to civil society leaders. I mean, and she says, does he have a close relationship with any of them? Does he listen to any specific leaders or follow them? Or does his strong sense of civic identity come from his grounded background, so well described, and his own values? So I guess, yeah.
Should we take some questions from the room as well together, or
We will,
one at a
actually,
time? Okay,
yeah.
you're
We will
ready.
definitely. I'm actually waiting. I don't see any
There's a
Okay.
few that raise their hands.
Okay, maybe I
that's
just missed
making
that.
sure.
Okay, answer this question and I'll go to this one. Yeah.
How about I briefly start and then Henry, if you have something to add. Does he have a close relationship with some civic activists? Yes. Is that relationship always public? No. Does he have a intense relationship with other civic activists? Yes. Have some of those people moved over time since 2019 to 2022? Yes, not all. Right? And it's very interesting having conversations with those individuals who moved and how, still being critical and skeptical, especially of things that are, I think, hugely problematic, and who has clearly something else that is holding them back to move on this. I think that's very interesting. But I think what we're seeing, especially now with this reshuffle, is that civil society actors are being listened to in terms of potential new candidates. They themselves have histories, personal histories and CVs that could be understood as civically engaged. Umerov is one such example. He was not simply a businessman. He was somebody that was deeply involved in civic engagement and activism. He was a young student going abroad for various pro-democracy and leadership training trainings himself. He started foundations that supported the Stanford program for Ukrainian leaders, in fact. Which that's a decade ago. He also started a foundation that specifically focused on supporting and promoting civic engagement amongst the Muslim community in Ukraine. Perhaps not well known in the Lviv Tusovka about the whole history of his CV, but certainly someone that has been very important. There are some names that are coming out for other ministerial positions, and there are people maybe that are listening to us that know exactly who was consulted in the process and how. And they were people that might have been perceived to be part of Holos or Yes or other opposition groups that are perceived to be part of the 25%ers, but nonetheless have been engaged in these conversations. So I think there's a lot of interesting change happening also in this space.
Great. So we will open it up. So why don't we'll start with 3 questions. You seem like a nice person. You say your name.
The rest of you don't.
Yeah, no, well, certainly not Frank. My God. But if you could just be brief and actually have a question, and then we'll move on. Maybe collect several.
Hi, I'm Olga Onuch, postdoctoral fellow here. I just started, and I can only hope that in 13 years from now, I will also be presenting a fabulous book here. So I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first one is about his identity, and Henry Hale already touched on that, on his Jewish background. I wonder if you included questions about that in your surveys, and how over time, whether there has been any change, especially if you have, I don't know if you have surveys from since the beginning of the war. That's really, wow, that's phenomenal. So if that has resonated at all with the Ukrainians, especially given, just 2 days ago, Putin has called him an ethnic Jew again. So whether it has any currency. And the second very brief question, not about the book, but the title, The Zelensky Effect, is there a Zelensky effect on some kind of postmodern leader, the way Zelensky communicates with the global community, the way he leads the country, the way he uses mass communications, and so on, as a sort of new postmodern leadership type? That's
Frank.
First of all, I want to say it's a fascinating book already, which I haven't gotten my hands on, but just this combination of the person, who I assume we'll get something about, but also the kind of research you've been doing, which I think it gives us the background on it. What I'm interested in is concept of politics and how politics will work. He comes with a rather strange group of people that are called Sluhi Narodu. Does he have a conceptualization of political parties, of what kind of future Ukraine should have with these parties? Can you see him dealing with the inevitable changes and splits that would occur after Ukraine would get its independence? And is he using as well? I mean, we now have the new appointment of the defense minister who comes from another faction, but is he open, therefore, to these groups? So Zelensky and his political concepts and political party.
So can you say your name? Sorry.
Yeah, Morris. A fair bit has been written lately about the ugliness of the corruption that's kind of coming back. And so I'd love your insight into how you feel he's dealing with it and his concerns with it, given that the kind of Western world that he needs help with can easily start using that as an excuse to reduce support.
We'll go next round. So yeah, I think you have plenty to deal with right now. So
Henry, did you hear of all of those?
I think so, yep, for the most part.
All right, how about I start and then you fill in and I'll pick and choose and, sorry, and then Henry will add. Olga, the identity Jewish background. There's a lot of things that we talk about in the book, and there's a lot of things that we don't talk about in the book, and the multitude of analyses that we ran that we don't include in the book. Some of this may be for future publications, some of these may be for private conversations. Is it a currency within Ukraine? I think for some people, this is a very positive thing, because they did see their country as liberal European and so on. For some people, this is not necessarily a positive thing. And there are some connections to people viewing him critically and holding anti-Semitic views, okay? And that actually has been, we've seen that in a variety of different surveys over time where we had those things. So that's not, that doesn't mean that all those people who view him critically, right? So it's a mixed bag, and that should be, I think, he doesn't also really use that element of his identity at all, right? His children are christened also, right? It's not this very, he doesn't use it for political means. I think that's interesting. And we don't know how pious he is or how religion features in his everyday life either. What we do know is he values the multi-ethnic components of Ukrainian society, that we know that he has done a lot to bring to the fore key Crimean Tatar leaders, and he has done that in a variety of ways. Umerov is just one example, who brings me to, I think, Frank's question about his conception of politics. I think it's changed probably over the last few years. I think his understanding of what he would be able to do and then what roadblocks he ran into, I think that was very clear. If you speak to people in the different that were in posts throughout his administration, you will have different views on how he handled some of those disagreements and how politics should be run more broadly. We know that he is opposed to this idea of patronal politics within the country. This is something that he has discursively told us, but also has taken key actions against that, where key oligarchic clans, individuals, personalities are the controllers of political parties, right? And or make the decisions that lead to key policies. The problem, obviously, with his party is that it is personalized in similar but different manner, right? So his party is just as personalistic as Petro Poroshenko's European Solidarity or Holos. I mean, that was just a copy and paste of Sluha Narodu, quite frankly, and one that didn't come across as very earnest and wasn't really well organized, and hence had no chance at gaining a real electoral constituency in the July 2019 elections. Whether any of these parties turn into the kind of parties that we look for, or the kind of things in these parties, the shape of these parties changes that we look for, that there's clear policy divisions between these parties, that's yet to be seen. At this point, European Solidarity lost really its policy sphere. The things that they argued were their policy sphere, that they had some kind of authority and control for, is now something that almost everyone in the Rada agrees on. In fact, European association and European accession was not even used in the 2019 presidential parliamentary elections because it was so obvious that Zelensky was pro-EU accession in the same way. You can no longer use that against him. So it was a Russian revanche instead, right? And so I think that's the next step for me. We mentioned that in the tail end of the book, but for me, it's what happens to the opposition. Are they able to figure out where their policy sphere is and how different it is to the others? Because that will very much depend then on what happens to them, also what happens to Sluha Narodu and how they compete for future elections or in parliament. What I can see about Zelensky today is that he has been very tactical, especially in this reshuffle, to reach out to so-called opposition party networks and ensure that there is buy-in for a lot of these positions. And that was one of the things when the reshuffle was announced. I was speaking to policymakers in London, and this is what we're going to be looking for. Is he able to attract people? And are the opposition insiders willing to contribute? They were part of the problem in 2019, in fact. So I think that dynamic is a very positive one on both the opposition side and Zelensky. Will that hold? How will that continue? If he centralizes power and he becomes, obsessed with it, that is also possible in a wartime context. That's to be seen. But these things are very positive, I think. And I hope that positive things will happen. I'm going to not say anything about corruption. I'm going to let Henry maybe say something about that.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll just add on the first question. I think we generally conclude that whatever the political effects of his Jewish background, which again we don't go into great depth. I think that's like a whole separate area of study, as Olga mentioned. On the whole, what we do conclude is the positives tend to outweigh the negatives for him politically, domestically, and certainly internationally. It's a big part of it's been a big positive for Ukraine. Particularly in terms of even if it's not kind of broadly advertised or stated, but at a minimum, just making it obvious that any claims, ridiculous claims that Putin may make about Kyiv being a Nazi state, right? It's just people just now would dismiss that out of hand, and so and even kind of tropes about Ukrainian kind of anti-Semitism at a broad level. While there certainly are those forces, as sadly there are in most countries of the world, it's clearly not the dominant strain by a long shot. And so I think it has those kinds of effects. I'm not sure about whether there'd be a postmodern Zelensky effect internationally in terms of, style. I mean, it's an interesting question, not one that I think we address in the book, but certainly one for research. I mean, you'd have to really define what the postmodern style is. In a lot of ways, I mean, certain aspects of that style are not his invention, right? Like using, social media, those things, some of those things had been used in a lot of ways by other candidates and campaigns. And in many ways, a lot of the like his campaign style, were I don't know, it would be very hard to replicate in other countries. So it maybe there'd be some effect, but most people who are interested in political office probably would, first of all, not be capable of doing what he did, and they might not even have the opportunity to do it. But it's an interesting question, so I wouldn't rule it out. I'd be interested to hear more about what you might see as the key elements of that kind of postmodernism, if I understood the question correctly. So just on Servant of the People, we go into its origins in some detail in the book, and it was a very hastily put together thing. I mean, actually, the juridical element, right, its legal existence was not hasty. In fact, it was kind of put into place almost in this completely unreported way, where suddenly after his Servant of the People television show was airing, suddenly without any big announcement, a Servant of the People political party appears on Ukraine's official registry of political parties. So journalists kind of got interested in that. Okay, what is this? Who's behind it? They would call the offices, nobody would answer. It was like they could trace who it was registered to. It was registered to Zelensky's team, the Kvartal 95 group. But that was really, it seems to be all it was, right? It had its office was in a lawyer's office. They clearly organized the creation of this party, but it was really only with the campaign itself, that a list was put together and groups were put together, and it was done in a slapdash way. There was no large Zelensky team of politicians, or like a party would have, that's kind of competed for power over many years with a concrete ideology. So it was a hodgepodge of people, the core being people who Zelensky trusted on a personal level, whether it was the lawyer that kind of helped set up the party, or the key people from Kvartal 95 and his production crew, or the television stations that he's worked with, but then a bunch of other people who kind of supported his cause and got in there through connections related to certain oligarchs, like Kolomoisky, who owned the television channel that basically helped make Zelensky famous over the previous the most recent years before his election. So thinking what's going forward, after that, I mean, there was a lot of weeding out, and as Olga mentioned, also a lot of people refused to take part, right? People who he invited and wanted to participate. So I think our sense in the book, which was sort of what Olga was saying as well, is that his instinct has been to be very inclusive as a political leader, to bring in people regardless of different political orientations or factions, so long as they seem to be the right people. And there was selection in both directions, meaning that there were a lot of people who tried to get in but were not let in, but a lot of people he wanted in who just refused to participate because they didn't trust him or had loyalties to other political forces. And so, I think the Ministry of Defense appointment reflects this inclusive orientation. But my guess is for the next election cycle, whenever that is, where there's a party, you're going to see a lot of weeding out now, because there is now a much broader Zelensky movement and political force. It's much clearer who shares like this vision
Breaking up.
that he's trying to communicate. That is kind of what I would expect. And just finally on corruption, I think it's kind of related to this. It follows on. We judge, I think, in the book that he's made some significant, but still in the larger context, modest progress on corruption. Among other things, making clear early on that people like Kolomoisky, whose media assets and other things clearly aided the propagation of his message, and were supportive of him in the campaign. He made very clear early on that he was not going to act on Kolomoisky's interests in particular. He's kind of gone after the oligarchs, taken a bunch of actions against corruption in Ukraine, including during the war. So there have been steps, but has it been a radical transformation of the system in Ukraine? No, not yet. In wartime, it's very hard to judge. The key test will be what happens after the war. And there are risks there too, right? I mean, there are risks if, he and his administration are feeling that they have to demonstrate progress on corruption in a public way for, to keep international support high. Because then the risk is that people get caught up in that net who probably didn't deserve to, one way or other. In some cases it seems obvious, but in other cases, it does kind of, seem like people maybe have been targeted because of their affiliation with or work in the government of previous administrations. And in some cases, there probably are real issues there. But in other cases, it's not all that clear. So, I think there are some risks of trying to appear like you're fighting corruption, even alongside actual progress on corruption that may be a little lower profile and less visible to the international community. But, I think my sense is that it's really kind of, the hope is that, like, with victory, we'll provide a moment where things can really transform for the better in Ukraine, where people can be rallied and convinced that the whole system has changed and therefore adjust their own behaviors accordingly. Because without convincing people not only that they should change, but that everybody else is changing too, I think, are you really going to, get a radical transformation of just the sense of how things get done, in a country like Ukraine.
So I will definitely get to you guys. So first of all, just a little bit of a pushback on the corruption thing. I think you're being a little bit, I would defend Zelensky on this a little bit more.
We do.
Well, then at least, the truth is that the war is a test of corruption. I mean, if corruption, we saw in Russia what corruption can do to a war effort, and that's certainly not what's happening in Ukraine. So what's striking to me, at least, is the fact that despite sort of, the Ukraine's identity as Kuchmanistan or whatever, back in the Kuchma days, corruption has almost dropped off the earth. I mean, so I guess the fact that they're fighting so effectively suggests even if there is corruption, it's not as big a deal as many thought. But my question actually is about personalism. And I guess the question is, obviously all of us worry that, what if some Russian smart bomb eventually finds its way into, and knocks him off? And so, the first question is, can we fault him for not promoting a number two, a vice president type figure that would sort of be an obvious person to step in should he have a heart attack? And the second question, or is it something sort of a nature of the war and people are always going to focus on, maybe that's sort of outside of his control? And second, if you could just pure speculation, who else might you expect to be kind of a replacement? So.
And just that in
Yeah.
Okay. Henry,
Yeah, go ahead. You can.
okay. I agree with you, Lucan, and I think that's Henry agrees with you as well, probably, but I shouldn't speak for Henry. I think the war has been an excellent test for the nature of systemic corruption in Ukraine, which of course does exist and has existed. But one of the things that we've been discussing with the folks that have actually, their job is just simply to monitor the extent of perceived corruption in different localities and countries around the world. So much of this is not based on actually calculation of money's lost or gray market and black market, but rather expert opinion. And expert opinion has reproduced itself over and over again because Ukraine should have been the place where corruption happens. And so I think we have a lag already in that. I think people started to see that there's a lag in that between 2019 and 2022 already, possibly even earlier. And that I think exactly this, that the war is very much showing us where there are still pockets of corruption that is hugely problematic and important, but how it's dealt with, and that even in wartime, it is being dealt with. And I think that is really not something that anyone would expect for Ukraine just a few years back. And, Reznikov actually was in his position as a Minister of Defense for a very long time, considering this administration. And he was very effective in many ways. But there were multiple reports coming in about specifically corruption around procurement, right? Okay, there are reports. He's not implicated in these so far, at least not to our knowledge. But it started to become impossible for him to stay in his position, right? And it wasn't about necessarily his mismanagement, but that mismanagement was happening and that we have to have a step change. And I think the fact that this happens in wartime, that this can happen, that it's announced well in advance, that it's managed by Reznikov himself also and is involved in this transition, right? That it's not this, that's something that we certainly would have not expected. And people, Transparency International is probably taking a look back at some of their expert surveys that maybe you and I have participated in the past and wondering who was a better predictor and who was a worse predictor of what was going on in Ukraine, because changes have been happening for some time. Who else? Personalism. I'm always really worried about the personalization in politics. I study Argentina as the other favorite of my cases. I think it can be very dangerous. We all know about the perils of presidentialism, and when that's combined with the rally around the flag effect and all the things that happen there, and when there really is no one, according to our surveys, we just got back one, that is an obvious person that could compete against him that would seriously even challenge the presidency at this time. I think that is always a worry. Are there not possible number twos? I don't know. I think there are. But I think I'm not going to say that.
Come on.
But
Come on.
No, it's sense.
No, you guys.
No,
Come on, you
Henry can. But I am not going to, I'm not going to say, I think there are people that can be, but they understand that in the time of war, it's not their time to shine. And I think that is a sign of a person who is doing the right thing in the particular ministerial post that they happen to have. The people who are trying still to shine, I think, are not understanding that very well. And I would personally like to see, this is not because I'm part of the 25 percenters, although my entire family certainly is. I would like to see some of the old guards step back because they are not electable. They will not win elections and pick a number 2 themselves. And I think the fact that we don't see clear number 2s in opposition parties is perhaps to me more worrying, that those opposition parties are still very much tied to a particular individual, right? And you can still stay powerful and you can still move the thing they call levers. Sorry, the levers, yes, let's go with that. And not be the face of the party, not be the candidate for presidency. And I'm worried personally that the opposition has not yet come to that conclusion. Because there needs to be someone that competes strongly against Zelensky that already has a political party, not a new person with a new personalistic party. That would not be a positive thought. Privately, I can tell you what I think, but publicly, I'm not saying number 2.
Okay, and if you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just point out, I mean, Ukraine has a line of succession. The chair of the parliament, becomes the acting president at least. And, by the Constitution, new elections need to be held. But, until that point, there is a leader. And, whenever there is a hugely popular leader, especially in times of war, it often seems that nobody else is comparable, but other figures ultimately can grow into those roles. So, that would be my guess as to, what would happen if there were, something like terrible that happened of the type that we're discussing. I guess that would be my what I would add there. And I would just add on corruption. I'd say like what we kind of in North America typically call corruption. In Ukraine maybe is more of a system for getting things done, and it involves dealing with people who you can trust, or finding ways to ensure the reliability of things getting done that you need to get done. Whether that's kind of perceived nepotism. So my sense is that in some senses. Certainly in the war, I think the naked personal profiteering, has pretty much disappeared, among, at least in a lot of the main areas of the war effort, to the extent that it's really going to significantly affect the war effort, with some, and when there are exceptions, they've made clear that they're going to go after it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the system has changed. And so that's kind of what I meant by saying the wartime situation is, we can't really extrapolate that to post-war necessarily. The key is going to be like, what happens after the war? Have people's attitudes and expectations about the reality changed? And will the command be given from the top to, really seriously, go after everybody in a non-politicized way, in a way that's going to, truly be transformative? Clearly, the state has been effective, but, very corrupt states can also be effective, depending on what type of corruption it is and where the corruption goes, right? If the corruption is stripping from the military, then it won't be very effective fighting a war. But, if the kind of corruption is used as a way of mobilizing, building force and things like that, societies can be pretty, can still be effective in that regard. So, I'm optimistic actually that things are changing and will change. I just don't want to jump to conclusions that where we're at now necessarily means that things are going to be, great once, even once we get a victory, because a lot still depends on, I think what in particular the leadership chooses to do, in the immediate aftermath of a victory.
Great. Okay, you have both been very patient, so we'll then do one round, maybe 2, hopefully. Go quick question.
You asked my question. Thank you.
Oh, you're so nice. I love you.
This has been very interesting, and I say this as a non-Russian or non-Ukrainian. Great insights, and it's really getting timely on the book. I have to say, Henry, because of the presence of Olga, so I would have said Olga. So Olga, I wonder if you always used Olga all the time. such a wondrous and magnetic and emanating personality, and you speak not only with knowledge, but it's the hope, bringing your totality, all that 18 years of study. It is a real marvel to behold you give me speech. I have to say that, really taken by
Feel
yourself.
very uncomfortable.
Very, very taken by yourself. Maybe my question is, when I've met Ukrainians here who are recent refugees or immigrants from Ukraine, I've met a handful of them, and I don't mean a lot, but a handful of them. You know what? I was brought up as a Russian speaker. I feel Ukrainian, but I'm Russian. Back to this question, what it is to be Ukrainian, you know, the civic nature, the ethno aspects, language aspects, the statehood aspects, very interesting. And for me, I'm always a little bit wary of the us and them. I think in Nazi Germany is one of my reference points for that. And that us and them can be a very real description. You can be authentic about that, but you can actually manipulate that in very nasty ways. This idea of what it is to be Ukrainian, I think, again, I'm not on top of this issue. I think
Sorry, can you
Zelensky,
just get to your question, sorry.
right, just this idea of the language, it seems to me this identification of that, because people are shifting the positions about what type of Ukrainian I am, the languages, even Zelensky, and I wonder even your pronunciation changed in receipts. I just as a question.
Okay, so my question like this is about something that happened in autumn or winter 2019 that I do not exactly know much about. I had a semester in Moscow, but I was cut off from the Western news. But there were like these scandals which Trump's campaign was involved in, that they were trying to blackmail Zelensky's administration for news on Hunter Biden's dealings in Ukraine. Now, how did that scandal play out either here in the West, because I was cut off, and how it played here and in Ukraine about Zelensky's image, and what consequences did that have, if any? That's because
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lisa Shemko. My question is somewhat related to identity. Last year, I read the former press secretary to Zelensky, Mia Mendel's book. And in her book, she tried to contrast Poroshenko from Zelensky, and she drew very heavily on the fact that Poroshenko's platform was what she claimed to be grounded in sort of the triptych of Ukrainian traditional politics, which was the army, faith, and language. And having experienced, all of us watching what's happened in Ukraine and listening to Zelensky's speeches, particularly his very passionate speeches during Christmas and Easter, you cannot help but find that, in fact, he is drawing on those very three issues that were somehow indicated, at least in her book, as outdated concepts, and that Ukraine had moved on. And yet now we see, at least in my opinion, I'm wondering what you would think, that Zelensky is very much morphed into adapting these principles as key in unifying Ukraine. And therefore, the differences between Poroshenko and him have somewhat been blurred. And perhaps they may even explain why there is no big visible opposition candidate to contrast from him, because he's to some degree pulled the rug from under Poroshenko in some ways by absorbing this. So, and it does that therefore make him a more effective agent of change with, say, the southeastern populace of Ukraine that were traditionally maybe would have viewed pushing the Ukrainian language and faith as all those Western Ukrainians, whereas now it's coming from someone who is Jewish and Russian speaking.
Great. So are there any other questions? Anybody else? Come on, guys.
I already give you so many questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
Stop there, make it.
stop there. Okay.
Okay. How about I give it a start again? So thank you kindly. That's very embarrassing, but thank you. My name has always been Olga, to those who know me. Not everyone can say my name. So people say Olia, and thank you very much, but I don't want to be called oil. And So seriously, people in Oxford or people in Toronto that are English speakers that would try to say my name, they would say Odia. And there's nothing nice about being this slithery liquid. But there's a lot of things that we're connecting here about Russian speakers' language and identity and the import of these things and how they are changing. There's some evidence, including by our colleague who is our co-author and collaborator on a project called IBIF, Volodymyr Zelensky, who has talked about people moving to at least reporting in surveys that they are using Ukrainian more. Yeah. The tricky bit about some of the stuff that we are studying there and that Volodya already published on is that these are not necessarily panel surveys that follow the same people over time. So we don't know how individuals have changed their actual practices. So the Mobilize project, which I run and which we started collecting data from 2019 and is now in the field this week, tomorrow, it's going into the field. We have been tracking people over time and we'll be able to see who switch, because a lot of people actually started switching a little bit earlier, who switches when and how, and if we catch any of those things and what are correlates of that switching should it have happened. So there is some changing of language practice, or at least of what people declare and report is their language practice. Now, language practice can be at home, in your private life, it can be at work, and of course, it can be in the public sphere, the survey that language that you choose, for instance. So language practice can be a variety of things. It can be embeddedness in certain networks, right? So at home, you don't necessarily have to be the one that decides what language is being spoken at home, right? Those of us who grew up in Ukrainian families that lived around the world, at some point that decision was made for you that you will be speaking Ukrainian, right? That can be a male in the family, that can be a grandparent living in that household. So when people report to us what they speak at home in private life, that can have a lot of implications itself. Your work embeddedness, again, it might be based on the types of jobs that you are eligible to take up. That is also based on your education. So there's a lot of things there. That's not necessarily people's just choices of what they would want to speak in. That's why we think that the survey language people choose and how Kyiv comes at that in their specific methodology is really interesting, the language that they feel most comfortable in. And so people that we know that have been Russian speakers all their lives are, at least we know anecdotally, we know through some focus groups, we know through some survey evidence, are at least in that public sphere trying to show that they are moving to Ukrainian as well. So this is very interesting. At the same time, there are people that are also reporting in different surveys and different focus groups and even publicly on social media that they will not be helping fellow citizens fleeing from occupied territories if they speak to them on the language of the occupant. So these things aren't clear cut, right? And I think that's worthy of discussion. I, in 2019 and then in 2020, was on Ukrainian television saying that Russian speakers actually can hold very strong patriotic views. A lot of people didn't like that I said that because by virtue of speaking Russian, people perceived that not to be patriotic. Different understandings of patriotism, right? And I think that continues today in the wartime context. I think for the median Ukrainian citizen, this is not an issue. For particular polls on one side and the other, this is an issue. But the broad majority, and certainly the broad majority that it will be electing the next president, this is not the thing that they care most deeply about. Trump scandal, we write about that in the book, and Henry can perhaps touch on that. And Yulia's book and what she wrote. I think the answer to your question and to what she wrote, yes and no. Maybe right message, wrong time. Certainly not the right messaging to win that election, right?
What right message?
Armia Vira Mova, army, faith, or religion language. That was not the message to use in that political campaign. That was not going to resonate with the median voter. In fact, I told people who were directly involved in that campaign in my own flat that that is not the message to win the median voter. The fact that they doubled down on that, that's really they're at fault for losing that election. I don't think it had to be a lost election for them, quite frankly. At least the data could have gone. No, we're talking about in Ukraine in 2019.
Okay.
That could have gone either way. So that would be on just the message. Was it a message that voters believed Poroshenko was earnestly a good representative of? Also, no. The data show that many people did not believe this message coming from this man for a variety of reasons, because he was the co-founder of Party of Regents, because he is known to have spoken via Russian speaker in his home for many years, that he moved to Ukrainian earlier on. So for a lot of voters that were key constituencies in order to shift that message didn't really work for him very well either. Did he seem like a very devout person all his life? For some people, that was also questionable if you look at the focus group responses, the various surveys that were conducted at the time, and so on. So whereas I do think that Zelensky has certainly moved to some of these positions by supporting specifically some of the laws that were passed recently, it's not something that he focuses on in his speeches necessarily, and he doesn't present it as this wholesale only way to be a good Ukrainian. And also, I think beyond that, it is his language, the very thing that I think Poroshenko and him do very differently when they speak. And we did analyses of their speeches, and some of that is in the book as well. The use of I and the use of we. And so even when we're talking about the army and the faithful language, there's a lot of we, us, the collective. We all belong to this, not they are doing this wrong, I am doing this right. And if you start looking at some of the just discourse and content analysis of those two speeches, I think that is where Poroshenko's rhetoric was most different from Zelensky's in 2019, and I don't think has changed at this point. So I've been doing, not in the book, a little bit of content analysis of Poroshenko's Instagram. You can all do it. You want to go into a weird evening at home, just take a look at his Instagram posts, TikToks, and yes, as well. There's a lot of what he is doing, what he has accomplished. Sometimes talking also about his party, oftentimes focusing on the state as not accomplishing something, right? I am delivering uniforms to the army, or my foundation is delivering uniforms to the army, but the state is not, it's leaving our boys behind. Now, if you can just match up to a Zelensky video where he says, our people are doing everything they can to support our boys at the front. And this very simple rhetorical device works wonders for those listening. Not least because the first message is actually not rallying around the state, even if the state is hugely problematic, maybe cannot be efficacious as we'd like in some instances. Not rallying around the state in wartime is a dangerous game to be playing, right? So it's what those three ideas, what they're paired up with. Is that paired up with we, us, everyone belongs in that collective? We, us, the state, supporting the state with those messages? Or is it Armia Viromova, us versus them, me as the only leader who can deliver on that? Those are very different ways of delivering that very similar message.
Just to follow up, so I guess my question is not so much why one candidate won over the other, but is Zelensky therefore the more effective agent of change in that demographic that never supported Poroshenko, and yet Zelensky is able to harness what would have been considered, sort of conservative right-wing messaging, but he is, because of that concept of a civic patriotism, more effective now in bringing that portion of the population over to, say, the political center.
The right wingers or the
the Russians speaking that would have been more sympathetic to Moscow in the past, but that
yes,
are
but
politically being brought to the political center now.
Yes, that's exactly what we've been saying, that is the 2 sides of the coin of the Zelensky effect, that the way he communicates his messages from 2019 onwards, in fact, are ways that resonated with constituencies in the Southeast, Russophones, ethnic Russians, who are already moving themselves in part to these positions, but then they had a vehicle through which to move even further. And so it's definitely not from 2022 that this is happening, but rather through, again, through different rhetorical means in 2019 onwards. But perhaps Henry has something to add here.
I guess not a whole lot. I think you've answered it well. I mean, I would just say kind of on the difference between the we and I discourse, there's a really interesting study in Ukrainian by Taisia Chernyshova in 2021 that kind of documents this, early on. I guess maybe I would just comment briefly on the Trump scandal. I didn't hear all that question too clearly, but if I understood correctly, I think, yeah, certainly as it played outside of Ukraine, that was not a good look for Zelensky to be implicated in this. And, because you're seen as kind of in a position of weakness, being bullied, by the president of the United States, and bullied specifically to do something corrupt, and him effectively being told that you have to do this, or you're not going to get military aid that you need to build up your defenses against Russia. So, it's going to, of course, put him in a very difficult position. It's kind of hard to answer that directly. And so, whatever the dynamics that were actually going on, or whatever the answer, or the response ultimately would have been, didn't give it, he didn't have to give in the very end. It was another instance of where, as unfortunately has happened in Ukraine with a lot of leaders in the past, they get reported internationally, prior to recent events. They get reported internationally primarily when there's some scandal or something unusual going on, right? So for him, it was like the Trump scandal, his election as a comedian, these kinds of things. But this was something obviously that transformed completely after the war, when people saw him in a very different light. Inside Ukraine, I don't think it weighed all that heavily. I don't think it was like a huge political, it had a huge domestic impact, as far as I remember, in Ukrainian politics at that time. We asked, well, anyway, maybe I'll just leave it there. But I don't think it was a huge deal. Whereas globally, I think it just contributed to this, the misperception of him as much more inept, than was in fact the case.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So thank you everyone for this wonderful way to start off the new year. Before I leave, a couple of things for those of you in the room: please buy a book. They're there. Buy them. Please tell them you can read them. It's good. And second, food. Eat the food. Otherwise, this is going to be thrown away. Yeah.
And just one thing: are there students in the room? Okay, students in the room. Okay, because I promised that the first student who came would get a signed copy. So I believe you were the first student then who came. So whether you want it or not, you're getting one. And there might be a test for the second copy then, because there's two students present. But I hope you read it, and I hope you share it with your fellow students. Yeah, there's actually a Spotify playlist that goes along with the book. If you're Ukrainian pop songs are all the rage now. Spotify playlist to go along with it.